right? And so thank you for taking the time to be here. We've got a topic that I think is probably really important. And in fact, it's something that I have spent now the better part of 15 to 17 years talking about. So I'm Dan Chase. Those of you that have participated in these before know that I've done a number of these with our team, the Leadership and Organizational Development team, as part of the Department of Human Resource Management. So our topic for today is leading with emotional intelligence. And we will jump right into that. But as is our custom, I want to share with you what next month's will be about so that you can start to get this on your calendar now. We realize that things get busy. And so I want to give you an opportunity to be prepared for that. So next month, sign up for this. You'll be getting, along with the recording of today's video, you'll be getting a link to registration, or we send it out statewide. But JJ Acker on March 29th, the same time on a Wednesday, March 29th, will be presenting on the positive impact of behavioral expectations. I'm not going to read his description there. Let me just say, it's difficult for me to imagine a more timely or more important discussion, given that their last legislative session's requirements, that those of us that manage, we talk about behavioral expectations, that we have behavioral expectations for our employees. Now, I would say about 40% of the people that participate in these off the shelves are non-supervisory personnel right now. And that's fine. Even if you are not currently a supervisor, you're going to want to jump on to this discussion next month that JJ is doing, because it will impact you nevertheless. And you are probably going to have to help your team format behavioral expectations. Okay, so this is, again, really going to be an important discussion next month, March 29th. Make sure you sign up for that. Now, emotional intelligence today, I'm going to start going through this really quickly. What are we going to talk about? A brief discussion on emotions and what we mean when we talk about emotions, and then talking about why this matters to emotional intelligence and what we even mean by that phrase that has now become ubiquitous, right? If I were to say right now, hey, press the raised hand feature if you've heard of emotional intelligence, well, at this point now, maybe as opposed to 20 years ago, 25 years ago, all of you are going to be doing the hands up or the thumbs up button, right? And then we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about what can you and I do as leaders, either in formal positions or not, to develop our what we are calling emotional intelligence. And then hopefully, fingers crossed, right? If we have time, we'll get to how leaders can help their teams become more emotionally intelligent, because it's different. It is different than just helping individual members on your team become more emotionally intelligent. All right. Now, the other thing I want to say about this, I wish this was not an actual picture of mine. I am the first to acknowledge that and in fact, this has become kind of disheartening for me. I used to think that I was really emotionally intelligent. I used to think, oh, that's my strength. I am learning as I get older and more experienced that actually this is something that I desperately need to become better at. And the reason I'm showing you this is for the sake of vulnerability and full disclosure that I am not the world's most emotionally intelligent person. I had learned to play tennis about 5 or 6 years ago. I really got into it. Now I'm kind of obsessed with it. This picture, unfortunately, I'm going to lose a lot of credibility, represents many, many rackets in those 5 and 6 years that have been lost because tennis is such a freaking frustrating sport for me. Now, I did learn some good news the other day, which is the kind of rackets that I use, they are more fragile than others. Nevertheless, this symbolizes me telling you I am willing to admit I am not expert at this, okay? So what do we mean when we talk about emotions? Because this is a really, really kind of squishy term, both emotional intelligence and emotions, okay? So first off, this is going to be a key. Edwin Locke is one of the world's foremost organizational theorists, right? And he said, emotions are the form in which one experiences automatic, subconscious value judgments. Pay attention. We're going to move through these slides quickly, but pay attention to this idea of value judgments. We experience emotions because something we value, either majorly or minimally, is being impacted. And then these things in our brains are telling us something that you value is being impacted. And then we experience them often automatically, often subconsciously. right? So that's important to note, right? Similarly, every emotion has a built-in action tendency. Sometimes, look, if I see something that scares me, that action is automatic and it's quick. But very often, if it's a low burn emotion or mood, we'll talk about, well, I don't feel this compelling need to act right away, right? But there's something that's telling you to act to either preserve or reject something that is happening to something that you value. And I don't think that we often think of emotions in that way. So I'm going to keep going here. Let me, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We have people monitoring the chat, but stay with me here. I want to talk quickly about the difference between emotions and moods. So an emotion, because we will use these synonymously, and the most key thing that you can see is probably this arrow in between the emotions and the moods, because they're mutually impacting. So if emotions are caused by a specific event, I got yelled at work, generally it's what we call very punctuated. I feel it very strongly, but it doesn't always last that long. Right. And we have lots of emotions. We'll get into the primary emotions versus the secondary, tertiary emotions. The reason we know, by the way, interestingly enough, that there are primary emotions is there's disagreement about what the primary emotions are, generally sadness, happiness, disgust, fear, things like that. But the reason we know it is because across the globe, there tend to be universal facial expressions to emotions. Isn't that fascinating? Take culture out of it, take geography out of it. Generally speaking, there are universal facial expressions to emotions, right? And then, as we already pointed out, they're action-oriented in nature. Now, while there's usually a specific event that leads to a specific emotion and it tends to be punctuated, notice that moods are generally longer lasting, and sometimes we don't know what the antecedent event was, what it was that caused the bad mood. And while there are numerous primary, secondary, tertiary emotions we might be feeling, generally speaking, moods are, I'm in a good mood, I'm in a bad mood. Now, what's the interplay here? Let's say I get yelled at by my boss at work and I go home. Generally speaking, what kind of mood am I going to be in? You don't have to answer that, right? A bad mood. Right? That's going to put me in a negative mood. Well, why does that matter? And why does that matter for our leadership effectiveness? Because what I've noticed with myself, something happens at work, and let's say that's the emotion I'm feeling was anger or something, and that puts me in a bad mood. I am much more likely to be prone to being, and I want to be very careful with this term, but what we call emotionally hijacked, meaning I act emotionally in a way that I'm not happy with later. I wish I had responded differently, right? If I'm in that negative mood because I got yelled at by my boss, I go home, my knee-jerk emotional hijacking happens with my kids when I go home, right? Or if I didn't get a lot of sleep the night before, I'm in a negative mood, I am much more prone to those negative emotions or being emotionally hijacked when I get to work, right? As an example. So I just want you to be aware of this distinction, the overlap, as well as the distinction between moods and emotions. And then why does this matter for you and me as leaders? So what you just see here is kind of like an emotional wheel. So you see fear, anger, surprise, happiness, disgust, and sadness there in the middle. And again, this is not hard and fast rules, but the primary emotions are there. And then there's these secondary emotions that stem from them. The reason I'm showing you this wheel is you're going to hear me say later, leaders, that understanding and increasing our emotional vocabulary is critical for increasing our emotional intelligence. So instead of me only being able to say, as a child might, I'm sad, I'm angry, but instead saying, you know what, I think I was hurt, right? Or, you know what, I think I'm feeling guilty about, or I'm anxious about this meeting coming up. The more that we are able to pinpoint and accurately label our emotions, the more we are better able to appropriately manage them and negotiate our emotions in a healthy manner. Okay. So again, we're still in this defining emotions phase, right? So here are some important concepts for you and I to understand about emotions. First of all, they are not unanalyzable primaries. but they are consequences of ideas stored in the subconscious. So again, a lot of people right now, one of the squishy things about emotional intelligence is this false notion of what we call the mind-body dichotomy. People saying, oh, well, we feel in our heart, we think in our minds. No, emotions come from our minds. Now, they might come from a different part of our brain than does our cognition, but it is still a part of our brain, and there is still interplay between our cognition, our ability to reason, and the emotional centers of our brains. Now, one other qualifying thing I want to say here about emotional intelligence. I'm here today representing the leadership and organizational development team. We are people who have a lot of experience helping leaders become more effective, and that's the angle we're taking today. I, nor anyone on the team, is not a neuroscientist. I, nor anybody on my team, is a clinical psychologist, right? We aren't. We're leadership folks. And so that's the angle that we're coming at this from today. I just want to make that clear, that is the key angle here, especially because as we get into emotional intelligence, if we start talking about diagnosing mental health and other things like that's beyond the scope of what we're trying to accomplish today. Okay. So back to our definition of emotions. Emotions can seem automatic, but we can change negative or hijacking emotions by changing the inputs. We'll talk more about that. Here's probably the key thing. There is not a conflict. There is not a conflict between reason and emotion. In fact, effective leaders use reason and emotion together. And then maybe most importantly, emotions don't compel action. Everyone, all of us, have the opportunity to take action, or including not taking any action, right, in the face of an emotional response. And in fact, I know right now, those of you listening are good at this, at least reasonably good at this, because, and I don't mean to be glib about this, you're not in prison. And again, I don't mean to be glib about this, you're not on the street right now. Our prisons and other places are filled with people that lack the ability to not act in the face of an emotional response to something. They lack that impulse control. Whereas generally speaking, functioning adults have practiced over a lifetime of not acting or acting appropriately in the face of that emotional response, right? And then it's really critical to you and I balancing our having an effective leadership success. And being effective leaders is this balancing of reason and emotion. Again, not treating them as mutually exclusive or contradictory enemies, right? And Judge and Robbins, two scholars who've written, I don't know how many times their textbook has been in edition, but in fact, we are better, we are more rational. Neuroscientists tell us we are more rational when we experience emotions, because your emotions, that part of your brain, is telling you something that maybe the cognitive part of your brain is not picking up on. So it's as we experience both emotion, utilizes emotion and reason, that we make better judgments, right? We're more able to lead effectively. And this is absolutely critical. So finally, same thing, Primal Leadership, a really popular book from the early to mid 2000s. Attuning to our feelings, according to neurological research, helps us find the meaning in data and leads to better decisions. It's understanding, not being afraid of your emotions. And I have to say one more thing here, because I'm already getting off track a little bit. I keep talking about avoiding being emotionally hijacked, and I'll keep using that phrase because very often leaders, you and I as leaders, we lose credibility when we get emotionally hijacked. But that is not to say that emotions, even what we might call the negative emotions, are inherently negative. Emotions are neither good nor bad. They just are. They are just these subconscious reactions to stimuli that when we recognize that something that we value is going to be impacted. And in fact, emotions, of course, serve this evolutionary purpose. That's why we experience them, right? And there is even a time and a place for what we might label anger, sadness, things like that. They're only negative in context if we feel that we are not being as effective as we would like. But there absolutely is a time and a place to feel anger, even in the workplace. There's a time and a place, and I'm just going with the primary emotions here. There's a time and a place to feel sadness, even in the workplace, right? So what is emotional intelligence? Now, I want to be very careful. There's a lot of people that balk at this definition because it's been defined in so many different ways since, the early 90s. There are some people who say, well, that's not an intelligence at all. And that's fine. All I mean when we say emotional intelligence is this is what we're going to define it as here. That's something In fact, you probably have worked, think of the leaders that you have admired that you've worked around in your professional lives. I am willing to bet at some point in your professional lives, the person that you admired as a leader was not necessarily the smartest person in the room. They might not have even had the most technical knowledge. They might have not had the most critical thinking. They might have not been had the highest, what we would call IQ. Early on in my career, I noticed this over and over and over as I'd work with aspiring leaders, and we talk about leaders they admire. It was the person, there was this something, this for lack of a better term, this je ne sais quoi that these leaders they admired had. I think what very often, what to me, when I learned and began studying emotional intelligence, I thought, oh, that's what this describes what they're talking about. So in the most maybe simple definition here, this is the ability to monitor our own and others' emotions, and then to utilize them as we need to, and have it inform our cognition, our reasoning, as well as help other people navigate their emotions so that we're using them to be as effective as possible, and not either suppressing them or indulging them. If that makes sense. And I'm telling you this right now, if this were a live class, and we used to teach a lot of live classes on emotional intelligence, I would have you go through those leaders that you admire. And I think really remarkably, over and over, what comes out is not the person like they were the smartest person I ever met, right? It wasn't if you're a Big Bang Theory person, it's not the Sheldons that we want to follow, right? It's not necessarily the Spocks that we want to follow. If you're a Star Trek person, it's that person that understands their emotions and other people's emotions, right? So again, some people balk at the definition of calling it intelligence. Well, even if we call it emotional ability, generally in the workplace, we look for three primary things. Physical ability, depending on the nature of your job, strength, stamina, flexibility, psychomotor function, sensory perception, all those things matter, right? Many in the knowledge economy, some of those things are mattering less and less. Cognitive ability, most people say, yeah, of course that matters. Verbal reasoning, quantitative ability, spatial reasoning, perception, all these things matter, right? In fact, most of our graduate school tests are primarily based on those first three things. Someone's going to go to law school, someone's going to get an MBA. It's what are we testing for? Verbal, quantitative, and their reasoning, their critical thinking. Very often, unfortunately, in our promotional practices, okay, in our promotional practices in the state of Utah and in organizations everywhere, very often we ignore this middle column, this emotional ability. So this is what we're going to talk about today. Is self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and then relationship management. No matter what we call it, whether we call it emotional intelligence, emotional ability, social intelligence, some people would prefer to call it, we're going to focus on those four things, okay? The other thing that we need to say is when it wasn't that long ago, I would say not long before the turn of the century, where it was still in some ways taboo to acknowledge emotions in the workplace. It was like, no, this is a place of business. Emotions have no place here. We know that is absolutely absurd. In fact, I will tell you, folks, I have worked with organizations in the most, what we would, and I don't want to offend anybody with this, but what we would call the most hyper stereotypical masculine environments. Maximum security portions of prisons, military, law enforcement, whatever else it is. And I'm telling you right now, emotions, whether you're in that environment or any other environment, absolutely exist in the workplace. They just do. And our ability to navigate those and understand our emotions and other people's emotions as leaders is going to absolutely impact our credibility and our ability to lead effectively. So these are emotional intelligence domains and competencies. We might not go through each one of these in detail, but I want you again to be aware of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. In fact, Shane, if you're on the call, I want to do a quick poll right now, okay? Without having gone into this in too much detail, I want you to participate in this poll. If you just had to guess right now, based on self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, or relationship management, which of the four do you think you need to work on the most right now? Okay. Shane has just launched that poll. Go ahead and take a minute and vote. Right now, without having gone into it, do you think you need to work on self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, or relationship management the most? Go ahead. We'll just give you a few minutes. Okay, Shane, I can't see this. Can you give us, Shane, if you're on, can you give us a report on this? If you want to close that, where did it come down, or can you share that?
I don't see where I can share it, but
Well,
self-aware. Do you want me to just read it to you?
Yeah. Give everybody what the poll came out as.
Self-awareness is 12 votes. Self-management is 32 votes. Social awareness is 14 votes. And relationship management is 31 votes. Total of 89 votes.
Okay. By the way, the poll, guys, if you look down, folks, if you look down at the thing on the right with the triangle, the square, and the circle, that's where the poll is. Do you see it now? Bottom right. Thanks, Kimberly. Bottom right-hand corner. Corey, you got it? Now, this is a little tricky because, and for our streaming folks, obviously you can't participate in this, but think about this question yourselves. Everyone got that poll now?
Yeah, we're getting a lot more results.
Okay. What are the numbers? What are the numbers now?
Okay, self-awareness 23 votes, self-management 45 votes, social awareness 20 votes, relationship management 62 votes.
Yeah, there's that relationship management again. That's not surprising. The other thing, by the way, and I don't mean to make light of this, the funny thing, of course, is if self-awareness is low, if we're not self-aware, how do we know we're not self-aware? Right? I mean, how do we're like, maybe we need to work on that the most, and and we don't know. Okay. Now, by the way, we're going to go through these now, and I'm going to give you an opportunity after hearing more about these domains and these, or what we might call competencies. I want you to think of, we're going to see if those ratios change. Right. Obviously, the specific numbers might change, but we're going to see if those numbers change. I want to give you one quick example here of what I mean by emotional intelligence. And those of you that know me, I've worked for the state for a long time now. I apologize for this. I'm going to share it anyway. What I think is just a great example of emotional intelligence, what we are calling emotional intelligence. And some of you will roll your eyes the second I say so. Abraham Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln. Maybe the story, maybe historians are still debating this, but so maybe apocryphal, right? But during the very famous 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates, which really made Lincoln a star before he was a relatively unknown quantity, made him a national star. He had these debates. Well, debates were different back then. It wasn't these 2-minute sound bites. Debates were like, you speak for an hour, someone gets an hour and a half rebuttal, and then they get to come back and speak for an hour. Well, just like today, if you can label someone a flip-flopper, a politician a flip-flopper, man, that's hard to shake. So Lincoln and Douglas are both going for the Illinois Senate seat, and they're having these really famous debates all over the state of Illinois. And in one of the debates, Stephen Douglas gets up and he says about Lincoln, he's two-faced. Southern Illinois had really pro-slavery sympathy. Northern Illinois didn't. And so he's like, hey, Southern Illinois people, Lincoln is telling the people of Northern Illinois different stuff than he's telling you. And Lincoln, for sure, he was a politician. He would say the things that he thought like the crowd needed to hear. But this was a massive political insult, even more so then than it is today. And Lincoln kind of just sits there and absorbs this debate or absorbs this insult during the debate. And when it's his turn to get up and speak, he says this. He doesn't get angry, doesn't lose control, doesn't lash out in the middle, but he says, my opponent has called me two-faced. I leave it to the audience. If I had another face, would I come out in public with this one? Now, why do we love that story? Why is that a sign of emotional intelligence? First of all, this self-awareness. There's not a nice way of saying this, but Lincoln was aware. Lincoln was weird looking. Right? Lincoln was a giant for his time, and even for other people that were his same height, 6'4" at the time, Lincoln was oddly built, right? He was oddly built, and he was just homely. He knew this about himself, right? Didn't shake his confidence, but he absorbed this insult and flips it, and he wins the moment, right? He wins the moment with the audience who love him for making this joke instead of losing control. So this is an example of what we mean by emotional intelligence. So let's get into these domains here. What is it? Why is this a leadership thing? Why are we talking? Why is this not just for a general audience, but we're talking to leaders and aspiring leaders? I'm absolutely convinced this is not sort of emotional intelligence is not the only thing that matters to leadership. But this just truly just off the top of my head, folks, when I thought about emotional intelligence and why I wanted to speak to a group of leaders about it, I believe that emotional intelligence, what we're calling emotional intelligence, these 4 competencies, absolutely impact at a minimum these things. Our communications are better, our decision making is better. We talk about helping people through change management is better if we're good, right? If we increase our emotional intelligence, we're better at resolving conflict, we're better at building teams. We help people we can find our own and help people find their motivation better. We create environments of psychological safety. We're better at creating trust. We impact team and organizational culture better. Our emotional intelligence impacts our credibility and whatnot, right? As we try and lead. And you guys, that was truly I was creating this slide that was off the top of my head. There are probably others. Feel free, if there are other aspects of leadership that you think being effective at emotional intelligence impacts, go ahead and put it in the chat. We've got people monitoring the chat, but this was just off the top of my head, right? But you can see why this is, I think that understanding this is so critical to you and I being as effective as we can as leaders, right? So again, I'm not going to take the time to read this whole thing, but why does this matter so much for leadership? Because we know that the feelings I feel at work on a day in and day out basis impacts my overall mood. So in other words, looking at the concluding point here, leaders who spread bad moods are simply bad for business. And leaders who pass along good moods help drive a business's success. This is absolutely fundamental to leadership. The last point I want to make before we do a deeper dive into our 4 competencies is this. And we don't really see these much anymore on airplanes, right? Because they do these on the screens. But those of us that flew before there was a screen in every seat, we know that this was the old what you do in case of an emergency card. I remember being an adult, being aware, maybe I wasn't an adult yet, the first time I was on a plane where they tell you to do what? If the oxygen mask dropped down and you're with a child, what do, adults? Put yours on first, right? I remember being like, what kind of backwards ethic is that? Where it flew in the face to me of everything I grew up with, which is no, women and children first on the lifeboats. And, that sort of thing. I'm all, what kind of backwards, like, hey, parents, save yourselves, screw the kids, is what I interpreted it as an adult. And of course, why? But now, of course, we understand why. Put yours on first, even if you've got a 6-year-old with you. Because why? Unless you are getting oxygen, you're not in a position to help anybody else, right? And that's the same thing is true of when we are being emotionally hijacked. Unless you and I can manage our emotions effectively, changes are coming. We're in the middle of a legislative session right now. We know changes are coming to impact us as state employees. Unless as leaders, we can say, we're okay. We got this. If you're being emotionally hijacked all the time, you're not able to lead and help other people manage their emotions. And that's why this is so critical. The other thing that you need to understand before we jump into the details of this, and I'm going to move quickly through this, is you need to understand that emotions and moods are contagious. And now this is true for every team member. We are impacting each other and our moods and emotions. So if positive moods and emotions matter at work and they make it a better work experience, we need to know that we're catching moods and feelings and emotions from each other. Okay. Now, everybody's contagious, but it is people that hold more formal authority, their contagion levels go up. We know this from research. We know this from lots of different sources. It's really kind of a fascinating concept, but it just makes sense, right? It kind of is a mirror of the old phrase, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, right? That kind of a thing. But it's true in the workplace, right? If constantly the boss is agitated, anxious, angry, or whatever other potentially hijacking emotions might be, then that impacts everybody in the workplace. And you and I need to be aware of that. People are catching our moods and emotions, leaders. Okay. So now I want to do one other thing with you. Here are our 4 things, right? Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management. Will you do this for me? Will you quickly I often ask when we do live groups to say, hey, what are potentially hijacking emotions in the workplace? What are those emotions that we might feel that are likely to compromise our effectiveness as leaders? So happiness is not usually one that comes up, but if you will, in the chat, I'm not going to do a poll with this, but in the chat, if you want to start just typing in, and if you don't want to type in, if you're streaming, write this down. What do you think are emotions that you have seen that have made you less effective than you would have liked to be in the workplace? What are some of those frustrations, right? Fear, condescension, hesitancy. Oh my gosh, these are good. Frustration, anger. Keep them coming, okay? In fact, I'll tell you now, rudeness. Allison, I'm going to call yours out. Rudeness. What did the rudeness make you feel? Okay, let's think about that, right? I had an experience once where I was doing a live class on emotional intelligence, and I asked this question of the group, and actually there was no response. It got kind of quiet, and I said, what are some potentially hijacking emotions? And it was quiet until finally one of my colleagues, nicest, calmest person, just kind of raises their hand slowly and says, rage. And everyone's just all, holy crap. Like, you just see people kind of give her a little bit of space, right? But yeah, there are all these emotions that we feel at work. These are tremendous lists, right? We get these all the time. So another thing I want to point out here as we move into more detail is the self-awareness and self-management are more personal, inward looking, whereas the outward looking or the other focus is social awareness and relationship management. But there's one other component here that's critical. Self-awareness and social awareness are both about information gathering, information about ourselves, information about others. Whereas self-management and relationship management are more about what do we do with that information. And that's going to be, now it doesn't mean there's nothing to do with self-awareness and there's nothing to do with social awareness. There's action things that we're going to invite you to do. But I want you to keep this model in mind here. Here's our model right here that we're going to be working from. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is self-awareness. Now, it might be the most fundamental of all the competencies, because it's hard to do it, to have self-management, social awareness, and relationship management if we're not at all self-aware. Now, in particular, we use the term self-awareness very often. We want to be self-aware about our strengths and our weaknesses, and lots of things, how we come across. But in particular here, we're talking about our self-awareness about our emotional states and our moods. That in particular is what we mean by that. So my wife and I, we both know a couple of things about ourselves. I tend to be in a very bad mood when I don't get a lot of sleep, whereas my wife can get a lot less sleep than I can. She's fine. My wife tends to be in a bad mood when she hasn't eaten for a while, right? And I guess scientists are coming out now and saying, yeah, no, hangry is a thing, right? Well, we know this about ourselves. And one of the things that has helped us is knowing that. And we'll say to each other, like, hey, by the way, I didn't sleep much last night. She's like, hey, by the way, I got to eat soon, right? This is even just being aware of your moods or your emotions starts to help you manage it more effectively. So two other things that I want you to know. We already talked about, it sounds silly, but even as adults, it is important that you and I increase our self-awareness about our emotions and our moods by increasing our emotional vocabularies. Getting better, getting out of just the primary emotions and getting to really what it is. What's the best way to articulate how I feel? The evidence is the more I'm able to pinpoint, then be spot on with the emotion that I'm feeling, the more helpful it is to me. And then finally, knowing your triggers. I am aware, and I'm poor at this, but I'm starting to become more aware of my triggers at work, of what it is likely that in a meeting or a personality type or something happened that is more likely to lead me to a bad mood or a hijacking emotion than other things. What are your triggers? What do you think they are? Okay, I'm going to give you some tools here on how to determine what your triggers are here in a second. But let me do an exercise with you, because again, if self-awareness is so important and it's foundational to all the others, how do I increase it? Well, let me give you one tool. We're going to do an exercise here. I'm going to ask you, please, for this exercise, not to use the chat feature, because I don't want to start a fight. I'm going to show you a series of images. Now, these are meant to be evocative, okay? I'm trying to elicit something from you, but will you, whether at your computer, whether with a pen and paper or mentally, will you write down, and by the way, if the feeling is faint, that's okay. But I want you to write down either the specific emotion or the mood that these images put you in. Now, some of you, this will come up later. If you don't know what the image is, it might have no impact on you because there's no cognition to the image. So as I show you these images, will you right now pretend we're doing this live, and those of you who are streaming, do this as well. Will you write down the mood or emotion that you think this fosters in you? Okay. Please don't use the chat feature. I'm going to try not to talk too much, but I'm going to keep these up for about 5 to 7 seconds. Okay, next picture. Okay, next picture. Next picture. And next picture. Okay. Now, what's the point of doing that? Look, those are static images. You may not have any context for them, and yet we do that. Look, if I could show you video, or if I could remind you of narratives or experiences that you happen in your life, it's probably more effective. I don't want to embarrass anybody. I've got a a dozen or so, a dozen and a half of you on my screen right now that I can see, and that's it. Can't see the streamers at all. Can't see the 230 other 234. And so I'm going to apologize for doing this, but Becky Jorgensen, you're one of the people on my screen. In particular, when that picture came up of that child that was clearly malnourished and starving, very visible change in Becky's face. Remember what we talked about with the facial expressions here. And I hadn't planned on doing this, except I happened to look at that part of my screen, and there was Becky's very obvious, for lack of a better term, what I'm going to say looked like sadness and compassion on Becky's face. Then in the final picture, because I'm like, oh, let's see how this goes, where there was clearly looked like a reuniting of a father and a daughter who was a soldier who had been away, this obvious change in Becky's face. Okay. Now I want you to remember that especially when we get to the social awareness, when we talk about and reading other people, right? But the reason we have you do this is one of the ways that you and I increase self-awareness is throughout a day. Leaders, take your emotional temperature, including in the middle of a meeting, right? Think about, you know what? Am I getting agitated here? By the way, this is really hard to do, but what am I feeling right now? It's even, by the way, some of the people who are the most emotionally intelligent leaders that I've been around, I've been so impressed when even in a meeting, they will stop and they will say, I am feeling this way right now. And that's so helpful to have that kind of awareness and to be honest, right? The other ways that are obviously, the obvious ways, I should say, of increasing our emotional awareness, seek honest feedback from others, people that will give you honest feedback about the emotional reactions you tend to have as a leader, the emotional or mood that you give off, that they sense from you as a colleague, right? And then the final thing is to reflect, to actually take the time, leaders. I hope you will deem this important enough to reflect on what are called affective events at work. When were times when you would say, I was not my emotional best in that moment? What was I feeling? What were the triggers? What was the context? All this kind of stuff is very helpful for you and I to then say, okay, what does that mean? This increases my awareness. What does that tell me for the next time I'm in a similar situation, right? So these are ways that we increase our self-awareness. Pretty obvious, but none of this is like rocket science. Some of you are going around and like, well, I would know to do those things. I'm inviting you to take the time to do those things now. That's really the trick with this, right? So remember, self-awareness is information gathering, in this case, about ourselves. So why? We can take better action, which would be self-management. What do we mean by self-management? In this case, we're talking about emotional self-control. We're talking about those that tend to have self-management tend to have higher levels of integrity, because when opportunities come for them to compromise their integrity, they're not swayed by that. Maybe somewhat counterintuitively, those that are self-aware and therefore have self-management are actually more adaptable. They're more adaptable because the external, being adaptable and changing external things doesn't bother them as much because their core is calm and in control, right? And then similarly, people that tend to have this competency they're not Pollyanna, and they're not naive to the challenges and the difficulties of the work that they're doing, that their teams are doing, but they're the people that say, nevertheless, right? Here are the challenges, here are the difficulties. Nevertheless, I think we can be successful. To me, when I think of that optimism, I think of my brother-in-law. He is about as good as anybody I know at saying, you know what, we got this. We're okay. Like, yeah, this is a difficulty, this is a challenge, but we'll be all right. Okay. These are ways that these are the things that people express who have this ability. And you can read that quote there from Aristotle. I love it. Right? There's a place for anger. Even anger as an emotion has a place, but to do it in the right way, right degree, right person, all those kinds of things, that's a hallmark of this. Now, I'm going to share a quick story with you. Those of you that have had training from me before, I've shared this story, and I apologize for that. I'm going to try and make this as quick as possible. But I love this story because I learned something new about it recently. So Joe Montana used to be considered, before Tom Brady, the greatest quarterback in pro football history. Won 4 Super Bowls in the 80s with the San Francisco 49ers. Well, in the second to last Super Bowl they were in against the Cincinnati Bengals, I believe I have that right, 1989, Super Bowl 23, the Niners were supposed to beat the Bengals. Okay. Now, the Super Bowl is massive today. It wasn't yet quite the national, de facto national holiday it is now. But Joe Montana, they're losing. They're losing by, I think it was, I can't remember if it was 1916 or 1613, maybe. And they shouldn't have been losing to the Bengals. And they have about 3 minutes left. They've got to go 93 yards and drive the length of the field to win the Super Bowl. Well, anybody who knows anything about Joe Montana knows his nickname, think about emotional self-control, it was Joe Cool, because he never seemed to be out of control. He always had this ability to keep calm. Why does this matter? Why am I talking to you about this as leaders in the state of Utah? Well, interestingly enough, here's a Super Bowl. It's 3 minutes left. It's right before this 93-yard drive that this offense needs to go on, and everyone's nervous. Everyone's like, oh, anxious. We're losing. Not a more pressure-packed moment in sports. And Joe Montana's kind of picking at the grass. He goes, "Hey guys!" In the huddle, he goes, "Guys, look over there. Isn't that the actor John Candy?" And he sees John Candy who had a sideline pass, and he points out John Candy on the sideline. That's actually the picture of John Candy at that Super Bowl. And everyone's like, oh yeah, look at it, check it out, that's John Candy. Well, I love that story because what did that do for everybody else? His teammates report to this day that moment they're like, we got Joe Cool. We're going to be okay. And of course, Joe Montana, the offense marches down the field 93 yards and he throws the game-winning touchdown. The reason I bring this up now, though, is I don't know if you can see number 79 there, blocking on Montana's right. I learned this recently. The reason I think this is even more cool now is it turns out his name is Harris Barton. He's blocking for Joe Montana there. Well, it turns out on the team, Harris Barton was known as the celebrity hound. He was the dude all the week before the Super Bowl was like, guys, this celebrity's here, this celebrity's here. He loved famous people. Well, it was interesting enough. He, more than anybody in that huddle, was agitated. he more than anybody was like, he was ticked off too, because he's like, I'm nervous and he's agitated because we're supposed to kill the Bengals, he said. And so think about that. He's the most agitated. Joe Montana, Joe Cool, knows enough, is composed enough, and knows enough about Harris Barton to say, hey, check it out. Isn't that John Candy over there? And totally calms him down. He's like, oh my gosh, it's John Candy, right? Gets his mind on something else. Now, this is pro football. This is not managing in the state of Utah or something, but I think this is the impact of self-management here. So I'm going to do something really quickly with you on how do I increase this, right? How do I increase the self-management? Well, this is how we think that we experience emotions, right? And it's understanding actually how emotions work. So I'm walking in the woods and I see a mountain lion, and then that's my reaction, right? It's mountain lion fear. It's automatic. It's subconscious. I'm not saying I should feel fear now. It's just boom. But there's more to emotions than that. And if you and I want to get really good at avoiding being emotionally hijacked, we need to understand how emotions actually work. This is how we experience emotions. Stay with me here as I go through this, because this as much as anything can change your emotional intelligence, in particular your self-management. So what actually happens here, the object, remember, is a mountain lion. What happens subconsciously is I know something about this mountain lion, whereas a 2-year-old might not. I know that this is a dangerous wild animal. I know I'm hiking in their territory. I know they can do me harm. Well, what's the value appraisal? What do I value that can either be impacted negatively or positively here? Well, I value my life, right? In this case, to put it simply. And then I feel that fear, emotion, and then the action comes, and I'm probably not smart enough. If it's me, I'm taking off, right? And then I'm mountain lion prey, right? But here's what we need to do. If you and I want to get better at managing our emotions, we need to understand this process, and then we can change one of these 3 inputs that come before the emotion. Let me tell you what I mean. The most obvious and the most common is, let's say that you're in a toxic work environment. Okay, unfortunately, not totally unfamiliar to some of us. Let's say you're in a toxic work environment. Changing the stimuli or the object, all the object is, it can be an animal, it can be an idea, it can be an experience, it can be a memory, it can be it's anything, it's a stimuli. In this case, it's the toxic work environment. And I don't like the emotion. It makes me feel anxious or angry or sad or depressed every day. Well, you know how many people right now are changing the object? You get a different job. You move departments. You move to a different team if you are able. Okay. And so you change the object. We do this in relationships. I don't like the way this relationship makes me feel, so we change the object. Let me give you another example with what if the object is fine, but we change our cognition about something. We'll talk about this here in a second, but changing the cognition is really the value and virtue of empathy. So let's say there's someone whose behavior you're not happy with. You know, the classic Stephen Covey example of you're driving home from a long week of work on the subway, and you see a dead, what you think is a deadbeat dad whose 3 kids are running amok on the subway, and it's bugging the heck out of you. You're so annoyed at this father. Like, gather your kids, dude, teach them some manners, that sort of thing. Let's change. Cognition is context. It's what we know about something. Let's change our cognition here. And I give you another piece of information. Of course, look, I'm using the Covey example here. The piece of information that I give you now is that this father is just coming back from the hospital where his wife has passed away. And he doesn't know what to do with himself. He doesn't know what he's going to do with his life, et cetera, et cetera. How does your emotion change? How do your emotions change? How do your feelings change towards this man? Because you changed the cognition. Cognition and the power of empathy is learning, getting more information about something. And all of a sudden we're like, oh, I didn't realize. Okay, I didn't realize this information. And that's the value and beauty of empathy in this other, or this social aware paradigm shift. Thank you, Levi, that we'll talk about here in a second. Last example here, I'm taking too long. Remember, you can change negative emotions, hijacking emotion by changing the object, the cognition, or the value appraisal. Value appraisal is probably the hardest to change. But one of the things that you guys, I'm still nervous. Every time, right now I'm nervous. Every time I train, I'm nervous. Every time I speak at a conference, anything, I'm nervous, right? But it used to be probably where it was costing me sleep, and it was really not good. Part of the things that did it is I felt pressure. I felt like every time I was in a room of 30 leaders, I had to be the smartest person in the room, and I had to have an answer to everything. Can you imagine the anxiety that causes? Until one day I got maybe the best professional advice that I ever got, which was, you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. Now, you want to know what you're talking about. You have to have some credibility, but facilitate the intelligence that exists in the room. All of a sudden, when it didn't matter to me anymore, a value of mine wasn't like, I've got to be the smartest in the room. Totally changed that hijacking emotion where it's like, I go to a training and I say, fine. No, I'm still nervous when I get up there because I for lots of reasons, but it's not the same hijacking anxiety that I would feel every time because I have to be the smartest one because it no longer mattered to me. It was an unhealthy value, and so I reevaluated that based on great counsel, reevaluated that, and the value changed. So that's how we get better at one of the ways that we get better at the self-management is we identify and we name our emotions. Remember that naming emotions matters. Identify their causes and then change the cause, the object, the cognition, or the value appraisal. And then we are able to disengage from sabotaging emotions. And then, of course, even when we have emotions, we can still consciously and rationally choose actions, right? So again, emotions aren't bad. They just are. But when we feel like we're being hijacked by them, the emotionally intelligent leaders change one of the objects, right? Change one of the objects if they can. Okay, so we've talked about self-awareness, self-management, social awareness. Stay with me. We're getting to some critical information here. This social awareness, this other looking. Well, Brene Brown and others have this great example, great little animated video on empathy versus sympathy. But socially aware leaders, they don't just sense other people's things. First of all, they genuinely care when they sense other people's reactions to things. And the other thing, a lot of people don't like it when I say this, but you need to know this, leaders. You need to be reading office currents. Okay, you need to be paying attention, for lack of a better term, office politics. You need to have that organizational awareness. If you are going to, even if you hate office politics, as many of us do, you got to pay attention to it if you're going to be able to do the noble things that you want to do as a leader, right? So empathy matters extensively here. We don't have time for this. Anybody know who this is, by the way? Last year, big news story. And I'd be brilliant if someone knows, put it in the chat if you know who that is. But for those of you that don't know, this might no, it's yes, it's from the Johnny Depp case. This was the Johnny Depp's teams, their psychologists they got basically to say that Amber Heard is crazy. So this was the psychologist Shannon Curry. Well, crazy. Shannon Curry. One day I wasn't paying attention. My buddy of mine, one of my best friends I grew up with, is like, "Hey, dude, are you following the Johnny Depp case?" I'm like, "Yeah." That's all I think about. I gave him a sarcastic response. He's like, "No, go check out this news story." And it's like, Dr. Shannon Curry. Well, Shannon Curry has stayed at my house, I don't know, half a dozen times. And in fact, it's weird. So I'm like, what the heck? She was dating one of my best friends. And so she would stay here all the time. Well, one time I was in the hospital. This would have been 2014. I was in the hospital for 2 weeks. And my buddy, who was very supportive, came from Hawaii to visit. And he and Shannon were there. Now, they've broken up. My buddy's married someone else. I don't have a relationship, a friendship with Shannon Curry at this point or anything like that. But as much as I'm like, don't have a relationship, I've got to give, as weird as it sounds, I've got to give Shannon credit for something. In the hospital, I was feeling a ton of anxiety because I had a friend and his family come and visit in the hospital unannounced. And I had Brian, my friend, and Shannon come and visit from Hawaii, straight from the airport to the hospital. And when you're in the hospital, there's only so much energy and kind of engagement you can do. And my buddy and his family came to visit. It was very nice, unannounced. They weren't picking up on like the dear friends of mine, this friend of mine and his girlfriend then, Dr. Curry, who came. I was like, the anxiety apparently was just written on my face. And at one point, I didn't know her that well then, but Shannon just said, "Dan, are you okay? Is this overwhelming to you? Would we be better off leaving?" Now, I got to be honest with you. I don't have a relationship with her now, but I still remember that now. In that moment, I was trying as hard as I could not to give off that vibe, and yet there it was. Now she does this professionally, right? She pays attention to the stuff. This is what I'm talking about when we talk about this other awareness, right? Leaders, you and I need to be paying attention. Sometimes this is harder. Sometimes this is harder in our virtual world, right? When we're having more virtual meetings. But even if you notice someone. In fact, I need to reach out to an employee of mine yesterday. I had a team meeting yesterday. That employee seemed particularly quiet. And I didn't take the time in that meeting to reach out. But even today, I'm like, I need to check on them just to see, because they almost never, they didn't come off mute almost at all. And I need to pay attention. It's this other awareness that matters. So how do you increase this? Okay, how do you increase this ability? Listening, I can't overstate the importance of this. Listen to people, whether we call it mindful listening, active listening. Listen to learn from the person and listen to understand where they're coming from. Accept their interpretations of events. That's one of the hardest things we do. We're like, oh, I'm a good listener. And then they say something, you're like, well, that's full of crap. Or, that you're not genuinely listening then. Read the room. Like Shannon Curry did in that moment. Read the room and then do something really challenging called perspectival shift, which is getting out, taking a moment saying, if I were that person, how would I be feeling about this conversation I'm about to have with them? Or if I were that person, how would this new policy impact me? This is one of the most unnatural things, and yet one of the most evolved things we do as human beings is this perspectival shift. Okay, it's absolutely critical, right? And then finally, stakeholder analysis. This is the politics part. You can't just know the game. You got to know the players. And I'm not asking you to become Machiavellian or anything like that, but understanding decision makers in your office. This is how we increase social awareness. Now, I'm moving quickly because you guys all have things to do. The last thing here is relationship management, which is the number one thing you guys said that you'd like to work on. Well, the thing that's going to impact you more than anything with getting better at relationship management is it's this stuff, right? It's increasing your social awareness. So this is a Valentine I got, last week, right? 8 days ago. Our deputy director is Greg Hargis. And I asked him if I could share this, and he got this homemade Valentine, which I just thought was awesome. Greg Hargis is a diehard Green Bay Packers fan. And I thought this was a great example of relationship management. He gave every person a Green Bay Packers Valentine, but they all said different things on it. To someone else who in the office who he knows is a Bears fan, it was kind of talking trash about how the Green Bay Packers quarterback always beats the Bears, still beats the Bears, this sort of thing. One day, think about this. One day in a meeting, I used to be obsessed with a coach called Vince Lombardi. When I was a kid, he was the Green Bay Packers coach, and the Super Bowl trophy is still named after Vince Lombardi. So I was a weird kid, okay? But when I was 12, I read this book by Vince Lombardi. So one day in the office, because there was a couple of Green Bay Packers fans, I came in and drew up the most famous play in Green Bay Packers history. It's called the Power Sweep. So think about this. Greg made me this Valentine. That means it's personal because he's a Packers fan. He had to remember that Weirdo Dan came into a meeting and on a whiteboard drew up the Power Sweep, with all the X's and O's, that sort of thing, and then took the time to homemade these and deliver to him. That's relationship management. That's relationship effect. That's interpersonal effectiveness, right? I love this example, right? Close friendships matter. So the more you and I, if we want to get better at this, what are we talking about with relationship management? Recognize the moments that matter at work. Okay. Moments that matter are when something significant happens to an employee of yours. Are you there for it? I'm not good at this, you guys. I'm probably about the most self-absorbed person I know, but I'm trying to get better at, okay, this person's in the hospital, this person's dog is sick, this person's going through this difficult challenge. Those are moments that are going to forge trust between you and the people you're trying to lead as much as anything. Pay attention to your observations. Understand and treat the people that you're trying to lead as if they have inherent worth. They're not means to an end, right? People that are good at relationship management understand you and I might have nothing in common. We might feel like we're from two totally different worlds, two totally different cultures, two totally different political perspectives, whatever else it might be. But people who are good at this understand, no, you know what? There's enough shared in the human experience that you and I can build these bonds and bridges. And then people that are good at this, they understand the importance of diversity. And by that, I don't necessarily, I'm not poo-pooing this. I don't mean EDIA stuff, as valuable as that might be. I mean the diversity of our experiences, the diversity of how we respond to emotions. People that are good at this, let others have those moments, right? So how do I increase my relationship management? You got to understand the mechanics of friendship. Let me go through this quickly, okay? It is, we are friends. We tend to be friends with those that we're proximal to, we're close by, we spend a lot of time with, and then that we find that we have similarities to, okay? Now here's the key part though. That'll give you kind of friends. To really create trusting friendships, there's another component, and that's vulnerability. The second that I say to someone, hey, I'm willing to be vulnerable with you, and I know I can trust you, and you can be vulnerable with me, and I'm not going to turn this on you, then real friendship is there. Recognize and respond to bids. I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm out of time. Bids are any gesture where someone does something. When they say, "Hey, I brought you," like if I've got an employee of mine who one day I always tease because he has the coldest sodas of anybody I've ever met. I don't know how he gets a soda so cold. So we were doing interviews one day. He's like, "Dan, I brought you some of these cold sodas," because I've been like, "Man, this is a good way to drink soda." That's a bid. Are we showing appreciation for those kinds of things when someone makes a bid like that? Right? Inside jokes are bids. Are we responding appropriately to those things? And then finally, just making time on your teams for sociality. Making times on your teams for sociality. Okay. We're out of time, but those are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management. These are the components of what we're calling emotional intelligence. These are the things that will help you be as effective as possible. Before you all jump off in mass, I want you to know that you can get better at these things. And it is absolutely critical to our leadership that we can get better at these things. Like anything else, this is practice, right? Even if it's not easy, we can raise not just our IQs, we can raise our emotional quotients as well. And the last thing I'm going to share with you is a reminder. Next month, don't miss this off the shelf from JJ Acker, who's an expert at behavioral expectations. It's going to help you with all these management changes that are coming up. He's going to, speaking of emotional intelligence, allay so many of our fears with these expectations. So excited for you to be with you guys next month. I'm going to hang on for a bit. If you have questions about emotional intelligence, really important topic. Thank you, everybody, and good luck out there. Please stay safe as well out on the roads.